Hi, welcome back to Relish Books. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Sherlock Holmes. So, there's so much again that I could talk about with these. They're not, I think, partly because obviously it's in a series of mostly short stories with some longer ones that might be kind of called novellas. It's not something that you see on lists of classics most of the time. It's not like on the 100 best books and Conan Doyle isn't held up as one of the great classical writers, but this is something that I would call maybe like a people's classic, because since the first Sherlock Holmes story was first published, people have read and loved the stories ever since. Conan Doyle famously wanted to be done writing the stories, and his fans just kept asking for more. He tried to kill Sherlock Holmes, and the fans wouldn't accept that, so he had to bring him back. And I think there must have been a part of him that did love writing the stories, no matter what he might have said, because ultimately it was his choice. The fans couldn't force him to do anything. And so, I don't know, maybe part of his hatred for Holmes was pretend. Maybe he didn't like him, but he did enjoy writing the stories. I don't really know. He definitely didn't want to be remembered only for Sherlock Holmes, though. He was a doctor, and I think he would have preferred to be remembered for his medical research, medical writing, of course, which I haven't read any of. But he did write a novel, full-length novel, nothing to do with Holmes. It was a historical novel, The White Company, which I do think is very, very good. I can't really talk about it a ton in here today because I haven't read it in years. I remember it being very good, really liking it. I would definitely recommend it, but has been a long time since I read it. But yeah, I think he probably would have rathered people remembered him for that. But he created one of the best loved characters in literature ever, which I think definitely makes it worth talking about. So the first Sherlock Holmes story that was published in a small magazine because none of the big ones would accept it. Was, of course, A Study in Scarlet, which was first published in 1887, I believe. But it was not the first Sherlock Holmes story that I read, because when he went on to publish more of the short stories, he published them in magazines, kind of like periodicals. He would publish all these stories, and they were put together in collections, and then the collections are numbered. So there's like the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is the first one, and then there's like the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, Further Adventures, all these ones. So we had in my family's house like all the collections in a row on the shelf, and then things like Study in Scarlet, Sign of the Four, Hound of the Baskervilles were usually like more in their own volumes. So I started with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, thinking it was the first story. The first story in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was the first Sherlock Holmes story that there was what I thought. And so maybe because of that, and it's partly nostalgia, I really like starting with that, even though in A Study in Scarlet you get who the people are, how Watson was introduced to Holmes, his first impressions of him. But I kind of like, and so for a new person, that's probably where you should start. But I kind of like jumping in and already just having this be the way it is, Watson and Holmes together, and just doing their thing. So the first story I read was A Scandal in Bohemia, which, especially thinking at the time that it was the first one that was written, is kind of an odd place to start, because it is one of the only stories. There are a handful of Sherlock Holmes stories where Holmes is actually either wrong, or he fails, or he doesn't quite fully fail, but is kind of messed up in his objective. I would put that story in that category. People will say, I think Holmes might even say, that he was outsmarted in this story, and he was, but it's more a matter of like that he was outmaneuvered. Like the person in opposition was just ahead of him, like one step ahead of him the whole time without him being aware of it. So he kind of was outsmarted. By Irene Adler, who has become, because of the way that she's talked about in the story, because of the way that Holmes thinks about her, she has in some adaptations become kind of a romantic interest. But for anybody who goes for that, I think you should go and read the real story, because Holmes doesn't think that way. That's not his character at all. That's actually something that Conan Doyle didn't like about the character himself, that it was like this cold machine. He only cares about intelligence and deduction. And that's not fully true. You definitely see glimpses of humanity and compassion in him in plenty of the stories. But Holmes did not come to admire Irene because of her beauty or her, her social status or whatever. It was only for her great intelligence that he came to deeply respect and admire her. There's nothing romantic in it. She is in love and by the end of the story married to someone else and goes on her way and is never seen again. She's only in this one story, and I think the reason that people use her is because that's the only times there's really anything. When people like make movies and stuff, of course they want there to be a romantic interest, and this is the only thing that you could like even take from the stories, because this is the only time that you see Holmes like really admiring a woman, and he speaks pretty poorly of women for the most part, but then this kind of changed his mind to a certain extent. So I get where people are coming from making that a romantic interest, but it's not accurate. Not at all true to who Holmes is. And speaking of adaptations, I like the Jeremy Brett BBC series pretty well. I like the first Watson though. David something I don't like. I think it's Henry Hardwick is the second Watson that they get on the show. I don't like him. Unfortunately, most of the show happens with him as Watson, and I really like some of those episodes, but once the first Watson was gone, the show is not nearly as good because he had a lot more of the warmth and like cheerfulness of Watson. The next guy is just really grumpy and old and not much fun. So that's sad, but I think Jeremy Brett does a really good job. They definitely did the series for too long because he got really old and he had a disease, he was sick, he was clearly miserable by the end of the show. They should have just ended it long before, but those early episodes are really, really good. A Scandal in Bohemia, for instance, is really good. Most of the stories are very true to the book stories, which I appreciate, of course. I have watched the first episode of the Benedict Cumberbatch series, A Study in Pink, I think it's called. I really didn't want to like that show because everything about it sounded wrong to me, like this more modern Sherlock Holmes where they call each other by their first names, which is just ridiculous if you've read the stories. Really didn't want to like it, so I was kind of prejudiced going into it. I actually ended up liking this different interpretation of Holmes pretty well. I thought that Benedict Cumberbatch did an okay job, because the thing about Holmes isn't really that he's arrogant. He just is so factual that he knows how smart he is, and he's not gonna, modesty is like something that he would never do, but he also wouldn't be arrogant. I think Benedict Cumberbatch brings more arrogance to it than Holmes actually has, maybe. But he does a good job of kind of taking the essence of the character and making it something new. I probably would have kept watching the show eventually, except I couldn't stand Watson. I think it's probably a personal thing. I just really, really don't like that actor. So that spoiled it for me. I just was not at all interested in watching further. If they had a different actor for him, I probably would have. But I haven't watched any of the Sherlock Holmes movies. I have no interest in doing so, knowing some of the stuff they did with the story. So I remember reading Sherlock Holmes for the first time. These books are kind of special to me because I very clearly remember reading, like, starting with A Scandal in Bohemia for the first time. I remember like taking it off the shelf and going and sitting in my special chair in the corner upstairs where I would like always go to read new books that I was excited about. And I remember just there's always that experience, that really special experience when you read something that's new, that's not like anything you've read before. And it's like you always remember it. It was something that I was very excited about and was very into. I was like at the perfect age to be really into it. And I read all of them that we had. I think I've read all the stories at this point, but because of the way that the volumes work and that some of them are kind of separate, I'm not positive that I have, but I'm pretty sure. Sherlock Holmes had his origin, Conan Doyle will even openly say that inspiration for him was from Detective Dupin, from Edgar Allan Poe's stories. There were only 3 stories with him. Some people even thought that Conan Doyle copied him to the point of plagiarism. I don't really think that's true. There's definitely similarities. You can clearly see that, but they're different enough. And I'm not a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. I like his poetry, but Detective Dupin is actually someone that I do really like, and I wish instead of writing all those other nasty stories that Edgar Allan Poe would have written more about this detective, because I think he is a really great character. He's really fun, really interesting. Those 3 short stories with him are probably my favorite Edgar Allan Poe stories. He's a really great character, but again, I think he's different enough from Holmes, and then that Conan Doyle openly said that that's where he got his inspiration. I think makes it more okay, and yeah, Conan Doyle didn't really like the character of Sherlock Holmes. He didn't want to keep writing about him. I always think it's so funny when authors are like that, or when they don't see the value in their own work. So often people will see so much more meaning and goodness in a story than the author themselves, and I just think that that's really interesting. Everyone's different perspectives. For instance, Conan Doyle saying that Sherlock Holmes had like no emotion and was like a machine, when he wrote these like more touching scenes with Holmes. There's this one part that's really, really special, really beautiful, and makes it into one of the Jeremy Brett shows, like word for word, which I love. And some people were actually upset by it, if you like look it up online, saying that Holmes would never have been like this. But it's a little scene. I don't remember which story it's in. It's in one of the ones about, there's like a missing blueprint. But I don't remember the name of it. There's several stories that are like about missing blueprints, but he just like stops for a minute. He's like in this room, and he just like picks up a flower and he starts talking about flowers, and how flowers in his mind kind of prove the existence of God, because there's something just beautiful, something just extra in the world. And a lot of people, because Holmes is like so cold and hard and factual, a lot of people are like, that's ridiculous that he would talk like that. That's not accurate. But I think it's very accurate. I think it's very true to his character if you really know his character. And it's a really beautiful passage that you should definitely look up. But, so, Sherlock Holmes, very special to me. I love all the stories. I think it deserves to be among the classics. It's more of a people's choice. But really great character. Always stick to the originals. I don't ever go for any kind of fan fiction junk, because he's such a character that has been made into this legend, and when he's that much of a legend, he's been caricatured a lot, and like certain aspects of him, certain lines that he's credited with, he never actually said. Certain things that he's like known for, he never actually did. So it's important to read the original stories because they're really, really great. So thanks.